What are the 5 best Street Fighter games of all time? We're counting them down from the main series today, but we are distinguishing between versions. Find out who makes the cut on this week's episode of Talkin' Block. Top 5 best Street Fighter games ever. In no particular order, okay? I'm not going to put us to that. Also, this is main entry Street Fighter games, so you're talking 1, 2, Alpha, 3, 4, and 5, but you can have the divisions, the versions between games. So there's like 6,000 different Street Fighter 2s. When it comes to Street Fighter 5, it could be Vanilla, Arcade Edition, Champion Edition. So that's kind of the parameters here. And we did a video last week where we talked about the 5 worst Street Fighter games. Please be sure to check that out and go in the comments and agree with us. But we'll jump right into it here, right after John tells you to like and subscribe the video.
Please like and subscribe. It helps the channel out a ton. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, guys. Okay, so in no particular order, the top 5 best Street Fighter game main entries of all time: Street Fighter Alpha 2. Alpha 1, as we may or may not have learned last week, was not the best, and Alpha 3 had some pretty big issues with it, but Street Fighter Alpha 2 seemed to find that kind of magic. I think the core of it was especially fun, and it was especially accessible, and it was especially Street Fighter. There were a bajillion copycats. There were, and other franchises, Mortal Kombat, King of Fighters, yada yada, and all of the other Street Fighter games at the time. But Alpha 2 felt very Street Fighter at its core, in that you could play this fun, neutral kind of based game, a little more defensive and such, but then it also gave you access to some really fun, sort of new super sort of stuff. Street Fighter 2 introduced that at the end with supers, and that was kind of cool. But then Street Fighter Alpha brought in like the isms, the custom combos, and that was kind of the next level, and it did it really well. But John, what do you remember? You lived through the Alpha 2 days, and you were playing. What do you remember from this?
The graphic style was really impactful back then. It's we always talked about Street Fighter having the anime look and stuff like that, but this really put it on the map in terms of graphically, and then sound wise, and then you got characters like Sakura in the second game and stuff that really jumped out, and it was like this is where some of the most iconic characters and other stuff kind of got introduced, and that first time you see that character is such a big deal, and that's really what I remember about Alpha 2, and it was a lot of fun.
Yeah, and then, of course, it evolved into Alpha 3 eventually, but people had an issue with that. It became a little too high of a learning curve, as I understand it, so my research yielded. It was kind of difficult to get into, and then it had some balance problems, and I'm really not tethering most of this list to balance. Balance has not been good, over the years. We've been learning. It's been a growing thing. It's really more, how fun were these games to play? That's a very broad term, of course, but fun meaning it brings people back. And then the next part of that is, do you then have a game that goes deep and that people can, if they want to, continue to explore, motivated by how fun the game is? So Alpha 2 gets our first spot on this list. The next one up should be a surprise to no one. Street Fighter 3, no, I'm just kidding. It's Third Strike. Third Strike made this list. One of the most famous, especially within the Street Fighter community in the genre. Not the most successful game, generally speaking, but Third Strike is, it gave us moment 37, so there's that. But this was a game with, before I get into the core of it all, I think it had amazing visuals, which is something that people talk about, but they don't talk about enough. The sprite work in that, even though it's by no means as advanced or technological as what you might see today and what we're seeing for, say, Street Fighter 6.
The sprite work, actually, I believe Capcom set the world record in the Guinness World Record books for the most amount of hand-drawn sprites in Third Strike, I believe, as they set the record for it back then. So
it's amazing, and it's like every little detail. You can just have a character throw a Hadouken, or you can have a character throw a Hadouken and have the back of their gi snap out for a frame and come back, and it adds that much more impact, that much more grace to one of Chun-Li's jumps, that much more power for one of Hugo's throws as the dust goes out and the screen shakes and his hair does a little extra animation. When you could tell the elbow grease and the effort went into it, the love was there. The audio, very often, people will put the Third Strike music as the track to their YouTube videos sometimes. You hear that a lot. It's maybe not the best of the franchise, but it's pretty good. The Third Strike music, nothing to wag your finger at. But the biggest thing here was that it, I think, is the biggest competitive, hardcore Street Fighter experience that we've had maybe to date. on the competitive side of things, Street Fighter 3 is kind of still the standard in a lot of ways. Not very well balanced. You could laugh at it, especially by today's standards and such. But what it did was, of course, it was based around this parry mechanic that was a huge part of it. And as I try to, articulate this, it was an evident display of intent and execution. This was a game where you could see people implementing their game plans and then executing upon them. It provides a well of training and effort that you can put into seemingly forever and continually get back from. And for those that really want to dial in and have the hardcore Street Fighter experience, here it is. Not everybody else loves it. It's not very accessible to the general public. But for those that really want to play Street Fighter and play competitive Street Fighter, this is your game.
Street Fighter Grandmaster Edition pretty much is what Third Strike is. Yeah. It's
Más o menos, yeah. All right. So then John's favorite, that John, Ultra Street Fighter 4. John, why is this one of the best Street Fighters of all time? Oh, you disagree heavily, huh?
Yeah.
Do you have anything that you could say positive about it before
I mean, it reintroduced Street Fighter. That's a big deal. Kind of thing. Street Fighter was dormant for a long time. Ono and company, they brought back Street Fighter, which was wonderful to have. In the vacuum the game lived in before we learned about option selects and all the high-level play that happened in high-level play, where you input a code and it does the thinking for you. Before we learned about all that, the game was quite a bit better. Then once you learned about all that and realized that the game plays itself, not as good.
Yeah. So yes, and so I got to specifically give this to Ultra Street Fighter 4, which is not vanilla, which in a lot of ways, the previous versions of Street Fighter 4 are responsible for the big boom of it. But yes, I will say that Ultra is the most refined version of vanilla, and in that case, it still is somewhat tethered to the responsibility that or the boom that Street Fighter 4 clearly brought with it to not only Street Fighter, which was a kind of a dead franchise at the time, but to fighting games in general. And it didn't just make fighting games popular, but it was very popular itself. It created an atmosphere where other fighting games like the next Mortal Kombat and the next Marvel vs. Capcom could come in, and if they did a good job, and they did, they could get a big piece of that pie too, and further surge a kind of new golden age for fighting games. But Street Fighter 4 rolled that carpet out, and Ultra Street Fighter 4 was the most refined version of that. For all of the faults that it had, at the end of the day, people wanted to play this game, and I know I've said it before, at the end of this game's life, when Street Fighter 5 kind of came in, there was still a big drive to play it. Now, not strong enough to bring people back to it from 5, a la Street Fighter, Alpha 2, Alpha 3, or Smash Bros. Melee to Smash Bros. Brawl. But without this game, it's obviously the Street Fighter franchise does not exist at all today. Not just because, you need to have 4 after 3 and before 5, but because it brought things back. A lot of people's favorite, a lot of people's not favorite, but you can't deny the impact that this game had on the franchise. There you go. So number 4 on this list, Street Fighter 5 Champion Edition. It hurts my soul, you guys, to put this on, as I sat and tried to figure out what positive things can I say about this and be honest. And my notes say, ask John. So, John, what do you think about Street Fighter 5 Champion Edition? Why is it one of the best Street Fighter games of all time?
Yeah, don't vomit too much over there. But anyway, I love this game because of the freedom of expression. I know a lot of people say it doesn't have freedom of expression in it, and if you go to the combo system, sure, if you're only expressing yourself through combos. But
it didn't have freedom of expression. It evolved that along the way. That was this is one of the things that I have.
Yeah.
Street Fighter 5, the developers figured out what the surface level problems really were, and they fixed those things. They added nuance. This game is an example of growing through problems and checking a lot of boxes that didn't start as checked, even if it's still not fun. But John, you were saying.
No, I mean, it's not for everyone. That's something we know, but if you can get into it, if you can untap it, and again, if you like Marvel vs. Capcom, the chaos, the intense offense that is in that series has been brought into Street Fighter 5. And I enjoy that. I do enjoy the chaotic offense and other stuff, even though I complain about it. It's still something I do. I think is a fun way of playing these games. When they're too vanilla, when they're too plain, I prefer much more bombastic gameplay. And that is what Street Fighter 5 nailed.
Street Fighter 5 in a way is opposite of Street Fighter 3 in that, and it wasn't this way at launch. If it were, it might have been a lot more of a success story. And it had sold 6.2 million copies for what that's worth. But it is now a much more appealing game from the window dressings. It's got a vast roster. It's got, you play the game, whatever type of player you are, there's a character for you, and there's an approach for you, and there's a way of playing it for you. For modern standards and practices, practices, and that's like DLC models as a business, and the fact that we now live in internet culture and the way that information flows around. You need some really established ways of approach that for your games to fit in, a template for your games to fit in. And Street Fighter V, well, I should say Capcom through Street Fighter V figured out a lot of those things, and they're applying them now. It's fine. It's good, whatever. But for as long as we live in internet culture and DLC works this way, I think a lot of games are going to owe a lot of what they do back to Street Fighter V and the things that it figured out. So a little bit of a pioneer in that way as well. And it checks a lot of surface level boxes, again, even if I don't feel like it's the funnest experience. All right, and then the fifth game, and I would say this probably is number one if we were ordering them overall, is Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo. Kind of the granddaddy of all fighting games. Every fighting game that came after it sort of owes a little bit of a nod, or a lot of bit of a nod, depending on which one it is, to this game for as ridiculously balance-wise, broken, busted, as many issues as this game clearly has. The fun factor, the enjoyment factor of being able to sit down, understand it enough, and then bring that into fruition, especially in the context of playing with your buddy, with somebody else, right? Yeah. No game has focused in and grasped this like Street Fighter 2. Even the modern Street Fighters, I think, are still trying to find this perfect fun factor that Street Fighter 2 had.
It's the ultimate pick up and play fighting game. Who can't pick up and play Street Fighter 2 almost from the get-go? And they made it brilliantly.
It's a good way of putting it. So even though Vega had his wall dives, even though Sagat had his ridiculous zoning, even though there were all these little bugs and whatnots, people were still motivated, widely speaking, to continue to play through those things and find answers. Now, maybe that's because the culture was different at the time, and people in my day, we didn't whine about it. We figured out how to DP on frame one, stuff like that. But all that said, the game is still around today. It's still played fairly frequently today. Yeah. It's not at all uncommon to see an ST side tournament. It's the game. And also, I will say this, it's not the earliest Street Fighter. Street Fighter 1 could technically take that title, right? If we're just saying, well, it was because it's old, because it came first, it's the template that all other fighting games owe themselves to. Well, yeah, but still, you could say that it owes itself to Street Fighter 1, its success, its ideas to Street Fighter 1. And we did not have that kind of pick up and play fun with Street Fighter 1. So I think Street Fighter 2 Super Turbo specifically really encapsulated that, really captured that. And they remade this game a handful of times through HD Remix, through Ultra, and there was a couple of others like handhelds and whatnot, and never were they quite able to capture the magic, broken bugs and imbalances and all, as Super Turbo. There is a special magic about this game, and in a lot of ways, it still is the greatest, I would say, fighting game ever created.